Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Sitogawa, and I'm with the State Office of Planning and Sustainable Development. Thank you for joining us this evening. And then I will turn it over now to Hunter Hevelin of Supersistence LLC, our consultant for the soil study. Go ahead, Hunter.
Thanks, Aaron. Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and evening. As Aaron said, my name is Hunter Hevelin. I'm a food systems planner, and my firm Supersistence has the contract with the state to pursue this important effort to delve into our soil classification systems and their use in the regulation of agricultural lands. And without further ado, we're going to start off with a bit of an agenda overview of kind of how things are going to flow for the day, and jump right in. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and drop your name and affiliation in the chat. So this effort, as articulated on the bottom here, is actually funded by the state through Act 189, passed in 2022, to study our soil classification systems, and particularly through the lens of their application in the regulation of our agricultural lands in both the state and the county layers. So over the course of the day today, we're going to go to the next slide, please. Give a little bit of the project background, just kind of who's here, why we're here, as well as looking at our soil classification systems. Somewhat of a, somewhere between a wade and a deep dive. I hope folks have had a chance to take a gander at the story map that was included in the invite emails. If not, hopefully we can get that pasted in the chat here for folks to click through and see at your leisure, conceivably another time. But after our soil classification review, we're going to also talk briefly about the way that some of these systems are integrated into our land use regulation, have a bit of a discussion about what we learned, kind of a Q&A on that, and then have a much more interactive portion where we're actually having a discussion about how we use these systems, their strengths and weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement, and ways that we might reframe or approach to explore how they could address some of the issues we face this century. And then we'll conclude with a quick review and talk about our next steps. All right. So for the blessed few, if any, who have never been on Zoom before, there's a few functions that we're going to be probably relying on over the course of this. There's a chat function in there. I think everybody's managed to put their name through. And you can use that chat function to share questions as we go on throughout. Raise your hand if you'd need as well. Also, I suppose flailing wildly could work in a group of this size. But just by whatever mechanism, we want to make sure to get your queries heard and addressed, though we may not necessarily do so in the course of the presentation. We'll certainly do so at the Q&A portion. So how did we get here? This project, as I said earlier, was funded by the state through Act 189. And in that legislation actually articulates that we are to have some, you could say, guidance provided through a steering committee that's composed of members from the State Department of Agriculture, from the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, as well as from the State Land Use Commission. So we have representatives from each of those entities who we've been have met with over the course of this process to help kind of steer and understand some of the opportunities, caveats, and so forth. The project is going to conclude with some reports to the legislature, and it will then be in their trusted hands to hopefully carry some of your voice and our work forward. So the team we have here today, as I said earlier, I'm Hunter Hevelin with Supersistence. I have the primary contract, but was able to assemble a crack team of experts to help pursue uncovering the various soil layers. And so we have representatives here today from G70, Barb and Ethan, if you guys give us a wave. They're leading the outreach efforts for this project. Not joining us, we actually have a soil scientist that we brought on particularly to be informing some of the perspectives around soil health, soil carbon. We are also very lucky to have Bruce Plash from Plash Econ Pacific, longtime agricultural economist and planner, who I learn something from every time we chat, as well as Dr. Azan Iwashika, an anthropologist by training who has been helping to wrangle together all of the various notes, ideas, concepts, and processes that we have going on. So for the effort overall, our work plan is really broken into 2 phases. The first being looking at the classification systems in depth, compiling their relevant regulations, as well as looking at some of the external, or rather other jurisdictions, then seeing how they approach some of these issues and the extent to which any of those may have some best practices we could draw from. We also have an initial outreach phase. This is nearing the latter portion of that. And then we're going to very hastily, well, I shouldn't say hastily, very quickly, also concomitantly be producing a preliminary report and an interim report to the legislature about the progress of the study so far. After those portions are done, we're going to take all of your recommendations and all of our research work and produce a set of preliminary recommendations. And then we're going to come back in the fall, or rather in the spring, to solicit some more info, and then we'll conclude with a final report to the legislature. Go to the next slide. So for that community engagement portion, we started off with 3 focus groups that were sort of the technical legal expertise. We had agriculture, environment, land use, energy, landowners, a variety of different perspectives to really try and build a robust corpus of ideas about how these systems are used. And then we've now moved through a series of kind of more county-focused discussions, even though we've been inviting folks who couldn't make it to prior ones to jump in wherever they can. And so these county group efforts are what we're in the middle of. We've got one more next week. But as I said earlier, once we are have completed our preliminary set of recommendations, we're actually going to come back and hopefully see you again sometime in the spring to review the recommendations that we've produced and have another opportunity for feedback to make sure we got it all right. In terms of other opportunities for engagement, there's some, well, I should say a variety of useful informations on the project website, including overlay maps, some historical background context, as well as some deep dives into the soil systems. There's also a discussion tool that we're going to be using a little bit later today. And we'll also be posting up some of the meeting summaries and recordings and some of the interim and final findings. In terms of the schedule for the effort overall, we're aiming to be completed about a year from now. And in the next 12 months, as I said, interim report, initial recommendations, some additional outreach, and then concluding with a final report. So what are we doing here today? As I said at the top, we're really hoping to explore how current soil systems, our soil classification systems, are used and how they can be improved. So we want to better understand how, or if you use any of these soil classification systems, your perspectives on their strengths and weaknesses, as well as exploration of, if you are aware of another jurisdiction that does something great, we'd like to hear about that as well. Before we go into the next phase here, just see if there are any initial questions about what we're doing here or why you're here. You can take those now. And otherwise, I'll just go ahead and move into our classification portion. All right. So, soil classification systems. We've got a lot of different ways to measure and approach the world. And we're going to talk about 4 that have been played a role here, or that were uniquely developed here, and that currently are at least integrated in one way or another into our regulatory systems. The first is the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Services Soil Survey Geographic Database, rolls right off the tongue, also called SSURGO. Others might shorthand it as just NRCS. Then we're going to go into the efforts of the Land Study Bureau, also commonly known as the LSB. Following that, looking at the ag lands of importance to the state of Hawaii, or ALISH, and concluding with a review of the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment Program, or LESA. So if you hear me using names or acronyms, that would be, I will do my best to reduce that, but it may slip out. So first off is the NRCS SSURGO database. This is a high resolution database that has 130 some odd different facets of information about a given soil. And these are used for everything from land use planning to agricultural assessments to engineering. And the database has been developed from information collected really over the course of a century here. So the early surveying work that happened in the islands, our first territorial survey, I should say, was released in 1955, but was based off of data collected in the mid-30s that concluded in the late 30s. However, the delay of that report was delayed in its release due to World War II, and that effort involved, traversing across landscapes along most of the islands, I should say, and as well as doing soil sampling in many cases, and in other spaces where there was maybe less agricultural activity, they resorted to some oral accounts from producers. So in those cases, I might have been talking with ranchers or landowners or farmers about how they perceive the quality and the issues of the land. That islands-wide effort was updated along with the soil taxonomical systems in the early 70s. So in 72, 73, even thicker set of documents was released that was based off of updated aerial photos and topographic maps. Subsequent to that, we have not had a islands-wide, a statewide update of our soil classification, of our soil survey. However, the SSURGO database does get annual refreshes where there can be slight modifications, or as soil science as a field continues to progress, there may be recategorizations, or if there are particular issues or landform changes, for example, a lava flow on the Big Island, that they remap what is now a very different ground cover, or a very different ground even. So this is, while a very robust system that includes a whole lot of different layers within it, one of which mapped here is what's called the land capability class, and this is a system developed by the USDA for grading land based off of the limitations for its use for productive commercial agriculture. This is just one of the many layers included, and it's used for a variety. In a number of states, the land capability classification is actually incorporated into some of their regulatory structures, whereas for us, it was incorporated into later soil system analyses, soil classifications, which I'll touch on. The SSURGO database is commonly used for a lot of different research efforts. For example, CTAR's Hawaii Soil Atlas or other crop suitability modeling is often underpinned with data coming out of the SSURGO database. So while robust and having complete coverage, as well as Hawaii being the first state to have complete coverage in the early 80s, it can be a little tricky to use, right? It's you have a spatial data set, you have a tabular data set, you need to be able to join those and figure out which of the 150 some odd columns you want to be mapping or using in your analysis. So it's what it may long for in some usability. In some cases, it has significant strength in that it does receive some updates, and it does contain a robust volume of information. However, after those early soil surveys, so the one particularly that was released in 1955, as the state was increasing its population, the territorial legislature moved on to the creation of a Land Study Bureau. And so the Land Study Bureau was created in 1957, ran for just shy of 20 years, and was really framed at providing, we could say, objective information for land use planning and development across the state. So at that time, we were having a significant rise in population. There was concerns around urban encroachment into agricultural lands, and agriculture at the time was, of course, the dominant industry, which was noted in their early reporting work. The LSB was charged with the production of classifications and approaches that could help inform effective land use planning. So what they ended up creating was an overall master productivity rating, which is on a scale from A being the best quality lands to E being the lowest rated. They only did this for agricultural lands, so it doesn't have a complete spatial coverage across the state. But it was a very robust system. So they actually took the averages of 7 different crop or agricultural land uses in terms of their yield, turned that into one output of a productivity rating, and then they had another system that was all about the soil texture and slope and and land position, and that was another productivity rating. They factored those together, and that became our overall productivity rating. Or rather, they aligned those with one another, I should say, not a factor system. This is arguably the most commonly used system in our regulatory structure, and currently frames the types of uses for agriculturally districted lands, and is often used in the development of agricultural zones at the county levels. So while it is statewide, it does not include any of the urban areas, and this map, for example, was updated by the Office of Planning some years ago to reflect shifts in the land use district boundary as the urban areas expanded. That being said, it does not include in any of its digitized data all of that rich information about crop yield projections, or some of the interior pieces to the sort of soil profile data as well. So lots of information, but again, not necessarily entirely accessible unless you happen to have a bunch of copies of old texts from the 60s through the 70s to go through page by page to really understand the different land units that they were analyzing with. Shortly after, the Land Study Bureau was defunded, in part because the legislature had felt like they were repeating studies, and in fact, they did do a detailed classification mapping effort for Oahu in both 1963 and 1972. They lost their funding, but the interest in protecting important agricultural lands and in agricultural land governance did not go away. So not very long thereafter, the Agricultural Lands of Importance to the State of Hawaii effort, which was forged. And so this was really a partnership between the Natural Resource Conservation Service, CTAR, as well as the Hawaii Department of Ag, following a federal Soil and Water Resources Conservation Act. So the intent there was for the SCS, this is the Soil Conservation Service, the precursor to the NRCS, was to inventory prime agricultural lands across the nation. So the Hawaii ALISH, I believe it was termed an ad hoc committee, was tasked with trying to understand how we would identify these lands. And while they inherited wholesale the prime definition that the federal government was utilizing, they created a special classification called unique to identify lands that were for traditional crops or other high value crops, kalo, coffee, watercress, for example, that if you were to be using a prime classification that might be well tailored to the Midwest, certainly wouldn't be recognizing, flooded lo'i as a prime land, right? So they created a special classification system to be sure to capture the unique aspects of Hawaii agriculture. And the last category was an other category, which was for lands that had some limits to their productivity, but were not necessarily we're not immediately in prime use or ready for it. So as this was criteria based, the coverage is not statewide. It just identified certain areas, and including the areas that were identified back in the 70s. There were also incorporated as a consideration in the standards and criteria for important agricultural lands in 1983. Not wanting to let the efforts fall to the wayside, this notion of ag lands of importance to the state became further enshrined in our Constitution during the 1978 CONCON, which had framed that we needed to go about the identification of important agricultural lands. And so the next effort, which again had a relationship with some federal interests, was called the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment Programming. And so this was again growing out of a national push. The LESA system was first developed in Orange County, New York, adopted by the SCS or NRCS at the time, expanded, and Hawaii was again one of the first states to try and really explore writ large how these systems could be developed. So Act 273 in 1983 created the LESA Commission, and that commission was tasked with the identification of important agricultural lands and to develop and propose, regulations to help protect those lands. So the LESA Commission took in the LESA system, rather, there's two major components: land evaluation, which is more akin to the soils, topography, climate, those kinds of factors, and which actually also included an output from LSB, which was called the Modified Story Rating Index, as well as an output from what we now call SSURGO, which was the Land Capability Classification. So these systems kind of weave into one another as the decades go on. The other component, not beyond land evaluation, was called site assessment, which is really then thinking about what's the context of this parcel within the broader development plan. And so how does it relate or not to county or state development plans? What is its surrounding infrastructure that could enable access to markets through transportation, and a variety of other, I think 10 in total other facets of that site assessment portion. These were then weighted and came up with a threshold, essentially, where if you got a score above a certain amount, then you are now mapped as an important agricultural land. However, despite the legislature having said that we needed to identify this, and then this effort moving forward, we did not, despite a few other testimonies and bills put forward to actually adopt this process, we did not indeed do so. So the LESA system is one of the least regularly surfaced in our regulatory systems. I managed to find it buried in a couple of administrative rules, but nothing in our Hawaii revised statutes, at least that I've managed to find so far. So, and again, as it's criteria based, it is not statewide, but the inputs to it echo somewhat what's currently present in Act 183 from 2005 for our IAL criteria. So while there's that list of site assessment and land evaluation components look very, very similar to what you see as the standards and criteria for our IAL designations or for our IAL petitions. With that, I'm going to take a deep breath, and I hope we can get some questions from the group and hear a little bit more about what you know about these, how you've interacted with them, and take any other clarifying questions or perspectives. I think to the point on how some of these start to interface, maybe I'll go through just a couple of slides here on the way that we've found these kind of engaging with some of the policy work. So I think one of the main systems, at least that I had been most familiar with prior, was just thinking about the permissible uses within the ag districts, right? So if folks aren't versed in planning lingo, we essentially have zoning at the county levels and then districts at the state level. We were the first state to adopt essentially a statewide zoning system, which is our state land use districts. If this is confusing, I apologize. There's a slightly better explanation on the website. But essentially those ag land use districts are governed in part the types of uses based off of the LSB land quality. And thinking about the soil data that was available at the time, which was coming from that 1955 territorial survey, which was based off a 1939 field work, we can draw a through line to say that a producer's perspective, a farmer, a landowner, a rancher in the mid-30s who was asked about their land quality is now factored into whether or not you can build a solar farm in the 2030s, which is an interesting, I would think maybe not explicitly, but feeds into the rationale for why we're here today, right? To explore, well, what else should we be considering? How could we have a system that is robust and addresses the myriad interests and concerns of both producers and planners? So that's kind of the ag land use districts at the county level. There are some other ones. We pop to the next slide. So for example, as I said, regulating solar development, Honolulu's golf course governance, as well as some other slides on or other pieces that are more about detailed zoning aspects, for example, with districts, particularly agricultural districts in Hawaii County, where they actually break out like a farm family agriculture versus an intensive agricultural district. So this is just really intended to just kind of give the highest level overview of the types of ways that these are integrated into our planning processes. But we are interested to hear what else you think would be important to include in these kinds of systems, or what you think the strengths and weaknesses are of them as you've experienced them thus far, whether that's thus far in your life or just thus far in your evening.